The room pulsed with light, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that mirrored the quiet hum of power flowing through the Imperial throne hall. It was a cathedral of dominance, a chamber designed to overwhelm and intimidate. Columns of black obsidian rose like frozen screams, and the ceiling was a mosaic of shimmering stars, each representing a system conquered by the Galactic Empire. Admiral Kasich Vren, draped in the crimson and silver of the Imperial fleet, strode to the center of the council chamber. His polished boots echoed on the marble floor, each step purposeful, each pause deliberate. His face, etched with sharp lines and a perpetual sneer, carried the confidence of a man who had never tasted defeat. "Esteemed counselors," he began, his voice slicing through the murmurs like a blade. "I bring before you a world so insignificant it barely warrants our attention. Earth." A holographic projection flared to life beside him, displaying an unassuming blue-green planet suspended in the void. Its oceans glittered, its clouds curled in serene patterns, and its continents lay cradled under the soft glow of its atmosphere. Vren sneered. A backwater, a relic of simpler times, primitive, fractured, and oblivious to the galaxy's true might. The council erupted in approving chuckles, a ripple of disdain spreading through the room. Vren continued, his tone laced with mockery. "Their so-called nations squabble like feral beasts. Their weapons, rudimentary at best. They are but insects waiting to be crushed beneath the boot of the Empire." Seated high above the floor, the Grand Chancellor leaned forward, his shadow falling like a shroud over the hall. His voice, deep and deliberate, resonated with the weight of centuries. "And what is your proposal, Admiral Vren?" Vren's lips curled into a predatory smile. "We will deploy the 1,000-year fleet, a show of force unlike any they have witnessed. Their surrender will be swift, their resistance negligible. Should they prove obstinate..." His eyes glinted. "The planet killer will remind them of the price of defiance." The room hushed. Even the mockery faded as the name hung in the air, heavy and menacing. The planet killer, a weapon of unspeakable destruction, its activation alone was enough to silence rebellion across the Empire's dominion. "And if," a lone voice interrupted, soft yet piercing, "your assumptions are wrong?" Heads turned, surprise rippling through the chamber. It was Archon Silas, the Empire's intelligence officer, a wiry man with sharp, calculating eyes. He remained seated, his posture relaxed, but his gaze unwavering. Vren's confidence flickered, but only briefly. He turned to Silas, his sneer deepening. "What are you suggesting, Officer Silas? That these primitives possess a threat we cannot handle?" "I am suggesting," Silas said, his tone razor-sharp, "that overconfidence has toppled many empires before ours." The council muttered, a low tide of unease beneath the chamber's grandiosity. "The 1,000-year fleet," Vren said, his voice rising above the murmurs, "has never known defeat. Earth will be no exception." The Grand Chancellor raised a hand, and silence blanketed the room. "Admiral Vren, you have my approval. Deploy the fleet. Bring Earth to its knees." His gaze flicked briefly to Silas, a warning unspoken, but clear. Vren bowed, the grin of a predator returning to his face. "As you command, Chancellor." The council rose as one, their robes cascading like waterfalls of silk. The decision was final, and the might of the Empire was now aimed at Earth. Far from the opulence of the throne hall, the fleet's staging grounds buzzed with activity. The space docks, massive constructs orbiting a dying star, shimmered with the reflections of 1,000 warships. The vessels hung in perfect formation, their sleek hulls glinting under the cold light. On the bridge of his flagship, the Dominion, Vren observed the fleet with a sense of pride bordering on reverence. "Magnificent," he murmured, his voice low enough that only the bridge officer beside him could hear. "Admiral," the officer began, his tone cautious, "do you truly believe Earth will be as simple as you claim?" Vren turned, his expression darkening. "Are you questioning my judgment, Lieutenant?" "No, sir," the officer stammered, swallowing hard. It's just, intelligence reports on their technological capabilities are sparse. If enough. Vren's voice was ice. They are insects. Do you question the wisdom of crushing a fly because it might have fangs? No, sir, the officer said, bowing his head. Good. Vren turned back to the viewport. Engage the fleet. We leave for Earth immediately. Deep within the labyrinthine corridors of the Imperial complex, Silas stood before a console, his fingers dancing over its holographic interface. Streams of data scrolled across the screen, fragments of intercepted transmissions and reconnaissance reports. He leaned in closer, his sharp eyes narrowing. One transmission in particular caught his attention, an encrypted signal emanating from Earth. It was faint, buried beneath layers of static, but its pattern was unmistakable. Curious, he murmured to himself. A junior officer approached hesitantly. Sir, the council has adjourned. You're expected on the Dominion. Silas didn't look up. I'll be there shortly. Shall I inform Admiral Vren of your findings? Silas's lips thinned into a line. No. The officer blinked. No, sir? Silas finally straightened, his expression unreadable. Not yet. Let the Admiral have his moment of triumph. He turned, his gaze lingering on the screen one last time before striding out. On Earth, the atmosphere was starkly different. Beneath a mountain range cloaked in perpetual snow, Commander Kale Dravik stood in a cavernous command center. Holographic displays illuminated the room, their glow casting sharp shadows across Kale's scarred face. We've intercepted their transmission, reported a younger officer, his voice tight with anticipation. The fleet is on its way. Kale nodded, his expression grim. And the bait? Taken, sir. They believe we're vulnerable. Good. Kale's voice was low but carried the weight of absolute certainty. Then let them come. A brief pause followed, the tension in the room palpable. One officer, older and grizzled, stepped forward. Do you really think they'll fall for it? Kale turned to face him fully, his sharp eyes glinting like steel. They don't just think we're weak, Colonel Varn. They need to believe it. Arrogance is their greatest weakness, and we'll make sure it destroys them. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a silence of shared resolve, of unspoken trust in the man who had led them through countless crises. Kyle moved to the central console, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared at the holographic representation of the approaching fleet. Prepare the shields, and make sure the decoy signals are steady. Yes, Commander. Kale's gaze lingered on the map. A faint smile, grim and knowing, played on his lips. They think we're the fly, he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. But they're about to meet the web. The air in the command center buzzed with tension, every hum of the holographic displays echoing like a countdown. Commander Kyle Dravik stood motionless at the center of the room, his piercing gaze fixed on the shifting map of the approaching Imperial fleet. His expression was carved from granite, a mask of unwavering focus hiding the maelstrom within. The faint, acrid scent of ozone lingered, a remnant of the quantum relays humming in overdrive. Kyle inhaled deeply, the sterile air laced with metallic undertones, as if the machines themselves were whispering their readiness. He placed his gloved hand on the console, its surface cool under his touch, and narrowed his eyes at the formation of the 1,000-year fleet. Update, Kale demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet murmur of his officers. A young lieutenant, barely past 25, glanced up from his station. His eyes betrayed both fear and admiration. Sir, their lead ships have begun reconnaissance sweeps along our orbital plane. Their movements suggest they've taken the bait, believing the decoy signals are genuine. Kyle's lips tugged into a faint, humorless smile. Good. Let them believe. Behind him, Colonel Varn approached with deliberate steps, the faint creak of his old boots breaking the taut silence. If they probe too close, Commander, we risk exposure. Kale didn't turn, his focus unwavering. Exposure is inevitable, Colonel. The question is when, not if. And when they see what we've prepared, it'll already be too late for them. Varn hesitated, the weight of years etched into his face. You gamble a lot on their arrogance, Kale. Kale finally shifted, his gaze meeting Varn's. It's not a gamble. It's a certainty. Their empire isn't built on adaptability. It's built on the belief that no one dares challenge them. That belief is their weakness. They'll throw everything at what they think is our last line of defense, not realizing it's their own noose. Varn nodded slowly, the ghost of a reluctant smile flickering across his lips. And you've tied that noose tight, haven't you? Kale turned back to the hologram. I didn't tie it, Colonel. They did. The room fell silent again, save for the steady pulse of data streams flowing across the consoles. Every officer was locked into their tasks, the air thick with unspoken tension. The sound of fingers typing commands, the occasional hiss of a vent releasing pressure, and the distant hum of the planetary shield generators were the only things grounding the moment. Commander, Dr. Gideon Rowell, the chief engineer, called out from his station at the rear. His voice, deep and methodical, carried a quiet authority. The quantum shield is fully operational, ready for activation at your order. Kyle turned slightly, his sharp eyes finding the stoic engineer. And the redirection systems? Functional, Rowell replied, his tone as steady as his hands gliding across the console. But untested under live conditions. They'll be tested soon enough, Kyle said. His voice was calm, but his words hung heavy in the room, drawing every officer's focus. A faint tremor rippled through the command center, a reminder of the scale of Earth's defenses buried deep within the mountains. The tremor was more felt than heard, like a distant rumble of a storm, a promise of what lay beneath the surface. Sir, Lieutenant Soren called out from his console, his voice carrying a note of urgency. We've intercepted a burst transmission from one of their forward scouts. It appears they've relayed confirmation of our false coordinates to their fleet. Kale's eyes glinted. So they've bitten. Yes, sir, Soren said, his fingers tapping rapidly. They're aligning their fleet into an attack formation, targeting the decoy zones. Perfect, Kyle murmured, his voice low, almost to himself. As the fleet's trajectory continued to play out on the hologram, Kyle's mind raced. His thoughts were a storm of calculations and contingencies, each layered with the weight of humanity's survival. The glow of the map reflected in his eyes, giving him an almost spectral appearance, like a ghost watching over the battlefield of the living. He exhaled slowly, his breath steadying the rush of adrenaline coursing through him. Ral, he said, his tone measured but firm. Begin sequencing the quantum mines. I want every unit armed and ready for remote detonation. Aye, Commander, Ral replied, his hands moving with precision across his station. Colonel Varn, Cal continued, his voice gaining an edge. Have the stealth drones on standby. The moment their vanguard breaches the inner perimeter, we strike. And the main fleet? Varn asked, his brows furrowing. Kale's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. We hold them. The longer they believe we're scattered and disorganized, the more exposed they'll become. Let their pride drag them in. The faint scent of oil and machinery filled the room as officers adjusted settings on their consoles, the tactile sensation of control grounding them in the face of the unimaginable. Each movement, each decision was deliberate, their significance far outweighing the smallness of the actions themselves. Kale took a step back from the central console, his gaze sweeping the room. Every officer, from the seasoned veterans to the young recruits, moved with precision. The tension was palpable, but so was the unity. For all their differences, for all their scars, this was humanity at its finest. Remember this moment, Kyle said, his voice rising just enough to command attention without shouting. Not because it's the beginning of a battle, but because it's the moment we show them what Earth truly is, not fractured, not primitive, but unbreakable. A ripple of silent determination passed through the room. Officers sat straighter, their movements more deliberate. The hologram shifted again, showing the Imperial fleet splitting into tactical groups as they approached the false coordinates. Their ships gleamed like knives under the stars, sleek and menacing, each one a testament to the Empire's dominance. "Sir," Soren said, his voice breaking through the moment, "we're detecting an encrypted signal within our own communication array." Kale's eyes sharpened, his mind already racing. "Source?" Soren's fingers flew across the keyboard, sweat beading on his temple. "Unknown. It's buried deep, piggybacking on one of our relays. It's sending bursts of data, coordinates, troop deployments back to the fleet." Kale's face hardened, his thoughts crystallizing into action. "Trace it. Now." "On it," Soren replied, his voice tight with concentration. Kale's pulse quickened, though his expression remained calm. A spy, in the heart of humanity's last stand. His mind reeled, sifting through possibilities, suspects, contingencies. "Commander," Raoul said from across the room, his voice steady but low. "If they have our deployment patterns—" "They don't," Kale interrupted, his tone cold and certain. "What they have is what I've allowed them to see. But if we don't stop that transmission, they'll have more than that." Soren's console beeped sharply, and his face lit with a mix of triumph and dread. "Found it. It's localized to one of the auxiliary nodes in subsection C double quote." Kale turned to Varn, his voice like iron. "Take a team. Seal the node. No one gets in or out without my direct authorization." Varn nodded, already moving toward the exit. Kale's gaze returned to the hologram, the Imperial fleet inching closer. The air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. He clenched his fists, his voice low but resolute. Let them come. The air within subsection C was cold. Not the natural chill of the mountain stone, but an artificial, sterile cold that crept beneath skin and into bones. Colonel Varn moved quickly through the dimly lit corridor, his boots clanging softly against the steel floor as the faint hum of power conduits vibrated through the walls. A squad of 6 followed behind him, their expressions taut with tension, their weapons gripped tightly. The auxiliary node loomed ahead, a pulsing blue glow spilling from the seams of the reinforced door. "Node secured," one of the soldiers whispered, his voice echoing faintly in the oppressive silence. "But if they've embedded deep, we might need to—" "Quiet!" Varn snapped, his tone low but firm. "Let's see what we're dealing with first." The hiss of pressurized locks disengaging filled the corridor, and the door slid open. Inside, the node chamber was a maze of flickering terminals and tangled wires. The harsh blue light made every shadow dance like restless phantoms. Varn's eyes scanned the room, sharp and calculating. Something was off. The usual hum of the system had a sharper edge, almost a whine, like a creature in distress. "Stay sharp," he murmured, stepping forward. In the center of the room, a terminal flickered erratically, its display pulsing with indecipherable lines of code. A thin man crouched before it, his hands trembling as they danced over the keyboard. He didn't flinch as the squad entered, his focus unbroken. "Kieran Halleck," Varn said, his voice hard. "Step away from the console, now." Halleck didn't turn. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, each word tight with desperation. "This isn't betrayal. It's survival." Varn's eyes narrowed. "Survival for who? You're feeding them our defenses." "I'm buying us time," Halleck snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. He turned, his gaunt face illuminated by the flickering glow of the terminal. "They're not coming to conquer, they're coming to annihilate. You think Kyle can stop them? That shield? Those drones? It's nothing. Nothing against what they'll bring." Varn stepped closer, his presence looming. "Kale's plan isn't for you to question. Now step away, or I'll drag you." Halleck's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Kale's plan will get us all killed." His hand hovered over a final keystroke. "But if they believe we're fractured, if they think we're not worth the effort, maybe they'll leave us alone." A single sharp crack echoed through the chamber. Halleck's hand froze in midair, his eyes wide as a dark stain spread across his chest. Varn lowered his weapon, the smoking barrel still trained on the traitor. Halleck collapsed, his body hitting the floor with a hollow thud. "Idiot," Varn muttered, gesturing to a technician. "Scrub the terminal. I want every trace of his transmission erased before it reaches the fleet." As the technician worked, Varn stared down at Halleck's lifeless form, his jaw tightening. Betrayal was expected in war, but this felt like a rot from within, a sickness that could spread. He turned to his squad. "Not a word of this leaves the room," he ordered. "Kyle has enough to deal with." Back in the command center, the tension was thicker than the cold air of the mountain bunker. Kyle stood over the central console, his fingers tracing the holographic fleet movements. The Imperial ships were drawing closer, their formations splitting into smaller groups, probing the decoy signals with cautious precision. "Report," Kyle said, his voice ablaze against the quiet. Varn entered, his face a mask of grim determination. "The node's secure. There was interference. It's been handled." Kale's gaze flicked to Varn, his sharp eyes probing for more than the words offered. "Interference?" "A minor breach," Varn said, choosing his words carefully. "Nothing actionable reached the fleet." Kale nodded, though his expression remained hard. "Good. If there's a next time, I want it stopped before it begins." Varn stiffened but nodded. "Understood." Kyle turned back to the hologram, his mind already racing ahead. The fleet's movements were deliberate, almost too calculated, as if they were waiting for something. He frowned, the weight of the unknown pressing against his thoughts like a vice. "Why aren't they engaging?" Kyle murmured, half to himself. Dr. Gideon Rahl's voice cut through the room like a steady current. "Perhaps they're studying, probing for weaknesses. They won't commit until they believe they have the advantage." "They already think they do," Kyle replied, his tone sharp. "Arrogance doesn't linger this long without purpose." Rahl tilted his head, his analytical gaze sweeping the data. "Unless they've detected something, a fragment, a sliver of doubt, that could be enough to stall their overconfidence." Kale's jaw clenched, the possibility gnawed at him, each second of inaction a dagger against his plan's precision. "Then we don't give them time to think." He straightened, his voice gaining a commanding edge. "Activate the first wave of stealth drones. Target their vanguard ships. I want them to feel the bite before they see the wolf." The officers moved quickly, their movements fluid and practiced. The faint hum of the drones activating reverberated through the bunker, a sound both mechanical and alive. Kyle watched the hologram as the drones slipped into position, their cloaking technology rendering them invisible against the void of space. Minutes stretched into eternity, the weight of anticipation suffocating the air. Then, without warning, the hologram flared with bursts of light. The drones had struck, their precision dismantling the vanguard ships in a symphony of destruction. The explosions bloomed like deadly flowers, their shockwaves rippling across the fleet's formation. "Direct hits on 3 vanguard vessels," Soren reported, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Their response is chaotic." Kyle allowed himself a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Let them scramble. Confusion is a weapon as sharp as any blade." The Imperial fleet began to shift, their formation breaking apart as ships repositioned to counter an invisible enemy. The decoy signals flickered in the chaos, further muddling their coordination. Kyle watched, his mind a storm of calculations, each decision building toward the inevitable climax. But then, something changed. The hologram showed a sudden surge of energy, a concentrated pulse emanating from the Empire's flagship. Kyle's smile faded, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. "What is that?" he demanded. Soren's fingers flew over his console, his brow furrowed. "It's a scan, high intensity. They're sweeping for cloaked vessels." Rahl's voice cut in, calm but laced with urgency. "If they pinpoint the drones, they'll neutralize them before we can strike again." Kale's mind raced. The fleet was adapting faster than he'd anticipated, their precision cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. He clenched his fists, the weight of humanity's survival pressing against him like a tidal wave. "Pull the drones back," Kyle ordered, his voice firm. "We can't risk losing them yet." As the drones retreated, the Imperial fleet began to reform, their movements more deliberate, more coordinated. Kyle watched, his expression unreadable as the balance of the battle shifted once again. "They're learning," Ral said quietly, his voice a mixture of awe and dread. Kyle didn't respond, his mind already leaping ahead, calculating the next move, the next feint, the next blow. The air in the command center was electric, every breath charged with the weight of what was to come. Kyle exhaled slowly, his gaze locked on the hologram. "Let them think they've gained the upper hand," he said, his voice low but resolute. "It'll make the fall that much harder." And as the Imperial fleet surged forward, their ships bristling with readiness, Kale's plan began to shift, the pieces moving into place for the storm yet to come. Kyle Dravik's sharp eyes were locked on the shifting holographic projection of the Imperial fleet as it reorganized. The subtle change in their formation was enough to stir a current of unease beneath his calculated exterior. Each movement of the enemy ships felt deliberate now, each adjustment a hint that the Empire's famed discipline was returning. The room around him buzzed with subdued tension, the air electric with anticipation and fear. The faint whir of the drones retreating filled the command center, their cloaking mechanisms shimmering like heat mirages against the void of space before disappearing into nothingness. Kale's brow furrowed as he traced the trajectory of the Imperial flagship, its sheer size a monolith among its escort ships. "They're baiting us," he muttered under his breath, though the room's hushed silence carried his words to those nearby. Dr. Gideon Rahl stepped forward, his gait measured. "If they're baiting us, Commander, they're expecting a strike." His voice was as steady as ever, yet Kyle caught the faintest note of caution beneath it. "But we don't yet know the scope of their adjustments. If they've adapted to our cloaking tech..." Kyle cut him off with a raised hand. "We don't give them the time to adapt further." He turned to the younger officer manning the drone console. "Lieutenant Soren, status of their lower formation?" Soren's hands moved deftly over the console, his face bathed in the pale glow of tactical data. "Their bottom flank is loosely guarded, smaller corvettes, a prime entry point if we deploy." Kyle shook his head. "Number? That's where they expect us to strike. We need them looking everywhere but where we are." He gestured toward the hologram, his voice sharpening. "Focus on their midline cluster. Draw their attention upward. Once they commit to reinforcing it, we'll split their upper command with a kinetic barrage. Gideon, ensure the drones relay false fleet signatures to mask our real deployment. I want their scans chasing shadows." Ral nodded, already moving toward his station. "Understood. I'll reroute the relays to match the falsified trajectory." Kale's gaze lingered on the hologram, the flickering blue outlines of the enemy fleet casting an eerie glow across his face. "This is a game of seconds," he said, his voice low but filled with iron. "And we'll make them pay for everyone." The hologram rippled as Earth's stealth drones darted into position, invisible ghosts weaving through the dark expanse of space. The faint vibrations of distant engines reached the command center like a heartbeat echoing through the mountain's core. Kyle's chest tightened as he watched the Imperial fleet's midline ships falter, shifting their formation to address the false threat. "They're taking the bait," Soren said, his voice trembling with barely concealed tension. Kyle leaned forward, his fingers gripping the edge of the console. "Hold fire. Let them commit. Not yet. Not yet." The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Every officer's breath was held, every movement deliberate. Then, Kale's voice cut through the quiet like a thunderclap. "Now." The command center erupted into a flurry of controlled chaos as Earth's concealed orbital platforms roared to life. The first barrage of kinetic strikes slammed into the Imperial fleet's midline with the force of an earthquake. The hologram flared with bright, jagged lines as ships buckled and shattered under the assault. Kale could almost feel the vibrations of the impacts reverberating through space, as though the mountain itself shared in the force of humanity's retaliation. The room was a cacophony of status updates and system alerts, but Kale's focus remained razor-sharp. His mind raced ahead, calculating the enemy's next move. "Adjust targeting patterns," he barked. "Do not allow them to regroup." The hologram shifted again as the Imperial fleet scrambled to respond. Smaller ships darted to fill the gaps left by the obliterated midline, their movements frantic. Yet Kale's satisfaction was short-lived. The flagship Dominion loomed larger now, its position shifting with ominous precision. "Commander," Ral said, his voice breaking through the din. "Energy readings spiking on the Dominion. It's charging something. Massive." Kale's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "The planet killer." A hush fell over the room, the weight of the name enough to extinguish even the most frantic whispers. Kale's mind raced. He had accounted for the weapon in his planning, but seeing it brought to life was something else entirely. "How long until they fire?" he demanded. Ral's fingers moved rapidly across his console, his expression grim. "At current charge rates, less than 2 minutes." Kyle straightened, his mind snapping into action. Activate the planetary shield. Divert all non-essential power to the redirection system. "Commander," Soren interjected, his voice tight with urgency. "If they fire, the shield may not hold." Kale turned to him, his gaze cold and unyielding. "It's not about holding, Lieutenant. It's about making them regret pulling the trigger." As the shield generators roared to life, the ground beneath them trembled, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the mountain. The room was bathed in an eerie green glow as the planetary shield formed, its translucent energy field shimmering like the surface of a restless sea. "Status of the Dominion," Kyle demanded. "They're locked on," Ral said grimly. "Charge at 95%. They're about to fire." The air seemed to hold its breath as the hologram displayed the flagship's weapon systems. Then, with a blinding flash, the planet killer discharged its energy, a colossal beam of searing light streaking toward Earth. The impact was deafening, even within the insulated walls of the command center. The shield absorbed the blast, its surface rippling violently as the energy cascaded across it. Kale watched, his heart hammering in his chest, as the shield redirected the energy back toward its source. The Dominion didn't stand a chance. The redirected energy slammed into the flagship with cataclysmic force, its hull buckling and fracturing under the onslaught. The hologram flared with static as the flagship disintegrated, taking several nearby ships with it. Cheers erupted in the command center, but Kale's expression remained grim. "Focus," he barked, silencing the room. "This isn't over." The remaining Imperial fleet faltered, their movements chaotic. But Kyle knew better than to underestimate them. They were wounded, yes, but a cornered predator was often the most dangerous. "Prepare the next wave," he ordered. "We press the advantage while they're disoriented." Ral stepped forward, his voice low. "That maneuver, the shield redirection, it worked, but the system's integrity is compromised. A second blast like that—" "There won't be a second blast," Kale interrupted, his tone firm. "We end this before they have the chance." His gaze returned to the hologram, the flickering blue outlines of the Imperial ships now fractured and scattered. Kale's mind was already leaping ahead, calculating their next move, preparing for the storm still to come. "Let them remember," he murmured to himself, his voice a quiet promise. "This is the day they learn what Earth is capable of." And as the command center prepared for the next phase, the faint echoes of the destroyed flagship lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the Empire's first taste of defeat. But the battle was far from over, and Kale knew the true storm was yet to come. The silence in the command center was suffocating, a heavy, almost tangible weight that pressed against every breath. Kyle Dravik's eyes never left the flickering hologram, its once pristine outlines of the Imperial fleet now fractured and smeared with chaos. The lingering energy from the redirected blast had destabilized the surrounding space, leaving the void to shimmer faintly with radiation. The Dominion was gone, obliterated in a flash of its own arrogance. Yet Kale's instincts screamed that the battle was far from over. "Commander," Ral's voice was steady but carried an undertone of urgency. "Shield integrity is down to 34%. Repairs are underway, but it won't withstand another sustained assault." Kyle's jaw tightened, his gaze hard. The faint hum of the remaining systems vibrated beneath his boots, a rhythmic reminder of the bunker's tenuous lifeline. "They'll regroup," he said finally, his voice low, a growl of calculation. "And they'll hit harder. They'll adapt." Ral leaned over his console, hands moving with practiced precision as he pulled up fresh data. "Their fleet is splintered, yes, but their secondary command ships are repositioning. It's a coordinated fallback." Kale nodded, his mind racing. "They're testing our response, gathering data." Soren, still hunched over his station, broke in, his voice sharp. "Sir, long-range scanners are picking up another energy signature, smaller but concentrated. It's originating from their auxiliary command ship." Kyle turned sharply. "What kind of signature?" Soren's fingers danced over the console, his brow furrowing. "Unknown. It's not a weapon. More like a pulse. Encrypted transmissions, heavily encoded." "A signal," Ral murmured, his tone thoughtful. Kale's expression darkened. The image of the auxiliary ship expanded on the hologram, its sleek lines marred by damage but still operational. "They're calling for reinforcements," Kale said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Or worse, they're signaling their next move." The faint tang of heated circuits wafted through the command center, mingling with the metallic chill of recycled air. Kyle inhaled deeply, grounding himself in the moment. "If that signal reaches their outer command posts, we lose the advantage." Varn stepped forward, his face a mask of hardened resolve. "Then we take it out." Kale's lips pressed into a thin line. The auxiliary ship was guarded by a tight perimeter of destroyers, their movements precise, calculated. The Empire was playing its hand carefully now, no longer rushing forward with the blind arrogance that had been their undoing. "Ral," Kale said, turning to the chief engineer, "can the remaining drones infiltrate that perimeter undetected?" Ral's response was immediate. "Not without significant risk. Their defensive array has shifted. The drones' cloaking systems won't bypass their enhanced scans." Kyle's mind churned, weighing options, probabilities, and consequences. The subtle hum of the hologram filled the room, an almost taunting reminder of time slipping away. Finally, his gaze hardened. "Then we send a decoy." Ral straightened, his brow furrowing. "A decoy, sir?" Kale gestured to the map. "We position the remaining drones here, just outside their scan radius. Simultaneously, we deploy a pulse emitter at the far edge of their formation. It'll mimic a high-priority signal, one they can't afford to ignore." "And when they reposition to investigate," Varn added, his voice gruff, "we strike the auxiliary ship." Kale nodded. "Exactly. But it has to be fast. Their window for recovery is shrinking." The plan was set in motion with ruthless efficiency. The room buzzed with quiet intensity, every officer focused, every movement deliberate. The faint clatter of keyboards and the low hum of recalibrating systems filled the space, blending into an almost meditative rhythm. Kyle stood at the center, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind already 2 steps ahead. "Commander," Soren called out, his voice breaking the quiet. "The drones are in position, pulse emitter ready for deployment." Kale's gaze flicked to the timer ticking down on the hologram. Every second felt like a lifetime. "Deploy the emitter." The command center held its breath as the emitter activated, its artificial signal cutting through the void like a beacon. The effect was immediate. The Imperial destroyers began to shift, their tight formation loosening as ships peeled away to investigate the false threat. Kyle's lips twitched into a faint, grim smile. "Now," he ordered, his voice cold and precise. "Send the strike team." The drones moved as one, their cloaked forms slipping through the fractures in the Imperial defenses. Kyle watched intently, his eyes narrowing as the hologram displayed the auxiliary ship's position. The tension in the room was palpable, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against every breath. Then, the first strike landed. A ripple of destruction tore through the auxiliary ship's hull, its shimmering shields flickering and collapsing under the concentrated assault. Explosions bloomed along its surface, violent bursts of light that illuminated the surrounding void. Kyle's grip on the console tightened as he watched the ship begin to falter. "Direct hits," Soren reported, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Their command systems are failing." But Kale's victory was short-lived. The hologram flared with sudden movement as a cluster of Imperial ships surged forward, their weapon systems lighting up like a storm. The drones, now exposed, moved to evade, but the enemy's precision was brutal. "We're losing the drones," Rahl said, his tone grim. Kyle's jaw clenched. The drones had done their job, but the cost was higher than anticipated. He watched as one by one, the cloaked vessels were picked off, their destruction marked by sharp bursts of light on the hologram. "Pull them back," Kyle ordered. "No sense wasting lives or machines on a lost cause." Rahl nodded, his hands moving to issue the retreat command. The remaining drones scattered, their movements erratic as they disappeared into the darkness. The auxiliary ship was crippled, its once proud frame now a shattered husk drifting aimlessly. But Kyle knew the battle was far from over. The Imperial fleet was regrouping, their movements more calculated, more deliberate. They were learning. "They're adapting faster than anticipated," Rahl said, his voice heavy with concern. "This won't hold them for long." Kyle's gaze hardened, his mind already leaping ahead to the next move. "It doesn't need to hold them," he said quietly. "It just needs to weaken them." The faint hum of the command center's systems filled the silence, a steady reminder of the fragile balance they walked. Kyle inhaled deeply, his chest tight with the weight of responsibility. The battle was turning, but the storm was far from over. "Prepare the shield generators for reactivation," he ordered, his voice firm. "And begin charging the next barrage. We hit them again before they can recover." As the officers moved to carry out his commands, Kyle's gaze lingered on the flickering hologram. The enemy was wounded, but they were far from broken. And in the depths of his mind, a question burned, a question that refused to be silenced. What else were they hiding? The thought gnawed at him, a shadow lurking at the edges of his focus. But Kale pushed it aside. There would be time for questions later. For now, there was only the battle, and the fragile hope of survival. The command center's air was thick with tension, the quiet hum of the consoles a fragile veneer over the storm brewing beneath. Kyle Dravik stood unmoving at the helm, his shadow stretching long across the glowing hologram of the Imperial fleet. Their fractured formation pulsed with faint outlines, each flicker a grim reminder of the desperate chess match unfolding in the void. The auxiliary ship was neutralized, but the cost had been steep, and Kale knew the enemy's next move would be brutal. "Status of the fleet?" Kale's voice broke the heavy silence, sharp and deliberate. Lieutenant Soren wiped sweat from his brow, his fingers flying over the console. "They're consolidating, Commander, reinforcing their central line. Looks like they're anticipating a frontal assault." Kale's lips twitched into a grim smirk. "Let them anticipate. Their strength will be their downfall." Behind him, Colonel Varn stepped closer, his heavy boots muffled against the reinforced floor. "They'll adapt faster next time. We're running out of surprises, Kyle." Kyle didn't respond immediately, his gaze narrowing as he traced the Imperial movements. The faint smell of heated metal mingled with the recycled air, a sharp tang that tickled the back of his throat. "We don't need surprises," he said finally. "We need precision. Their formation is tight, but it's also predictable. They'll react exactly the way we want." Before Varn could respond, a sudden burst of static erupted from the communications console. Soren flinched, his eyes darting to the screen. "Commander, incoming signal, from within the base." Kale's head snapped toward him, his posture stiffening. "What kind of signal?" Soren's hands trembled as he worked, his voice tight. "Encrypted. It's bouncing through multiple nodes. It's coming from subsection C." The room's temperature seemed to plummet, the faint whine of the consoles now an oppressive drone. Kale's jaw clenched, his mind racing. Subsection C, where the traitor Halleck had been discovered. "Shut it down," Kale ordered, his voice like iron. "I'm trying, sir," Soren said, panic creeping into his tone. "Whoever's transmitting, they're using backdoor protocols. It's embedded deep." Ral's voice cut through the rising tension, calm and analytical. "If that signal's transmitting, they're feeding intel directly to the fleet. It could compromise everything." Kyle turned to Varn, his eyes blazing. "Take a team. Find the source, now." Varn nodded curtly and was already moving toward the exit. The air felt heavier as he left, the weight of suspicion settling over the room like a lead blanket. Kyle's fists clenched at his sides, his mind grappling with the implications. One traitor was bad enough. A second. The hologram shifted again, drawing his attention back to the battle. The Imperial fleet was moving, their formation tightening around a newly emerging energy signature, a flagship. Smaller than the Dominion, but no less formidable. "Another command ship," Ral observed, his tone grim. "They're consolidating authority." Kyle's eyes narrowed. The ship's sleek outline bristled with weaponry, its movements precise, deliberate. It was no longer a battle of chaos. The Empire was regaining its footing. "They're testing us," Kyle muttered, pushing to see how far we'll go. Ral glanced at him. "And how far will we go?" "As far as we need to," Kyle replied. The faint hiss of a vent releasing pressure broke the tension momentarily, the cool air brushing against Kale's face. He inhaled deeply, grounding himself in the present. The next strike had to count. "Soren," he said, his voice firm, "get me targeting data on that command ship. I want its shield frequencies, weak points, anything we can exploit." "Yes, sir," Soren said, his focus sharpening. The room buzzed with activity as the officers moved with renewed urgency. The faint tap of keys, the low hum of data streams, and the occasional flicker of a console filled the space. But beneath the surface, a different tension simmered. "Commander," Varn's voice crackled over the comm. "We've reached subsection C. There's evidence of tampering. Someone's been here since Halleck." Kyle's grip tightened on the edge of the console. "How recent?" "Minutes," Varn replied, his tone heavy. "They're covering their tracks. But whoever it is, they're skilled. This isn't amateur work." Kale's mind raced. Another traitor hidden in the shadows of humanity's last stand. The thought gnawed at him, a corrosive drip against the foundation of his trust. "Find them," he said, his voice low but laced with cold fury. "No one leaves subsection C without my authorization." Varn acknowledged, and the comm went silent. Kyle exhaled slowly, his focus returning to the battle. The command ship loomed larger on the hologram, its presence a dark stain against the fractured remnants of the Imperial fleet. Kale's eyes burned with determination. "Ready the gravimetric disruptors," he ordered. "We're going to break their line." Ral's brow furrowed. "If we deploy the disruptors now, we risk—" "I know the risk," Kale interrupted, his voice sharp, "but hesitation will cost us more." Ral hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Understood." The disruptors activated with a deep, resonant hum, their energy radiating through the void like ripples on water. The Imperial ships wavered, their formation trembling as the disruptors' gravitational pulses disrupted their stability. "Direct hits on their perimeter," Soren reported, his voice tight with anticipation. "They're scrambling to maintain cohesion." Kyle allowed himself a fleeting moment of satisfaction. But then the hologram flared with sudden movement. The command ship surged forward, its weapon systems lighting up in a deadly cascade. "They're breaking through," Soren shouted. Kyle's mind snapped into overdrive. The command ship's boldness was unexpected, its movements calculated and precise. It wasn't just a response, it was a counterattack. "Redirect the drones," he ordered. "Cut off their advance." The drones moved swiftly, their cloaked forms darting toward the command ship. But the enemy's precision was brutal. One by one, the drones were intercepted, their destruction marked by sharp bursts of light on the hologram. "Commander," Ral said, his tone urgent, "we can't hold them at this rate." Kale's jaw tightened. The battle was turning, and not in their favor. But retreat was not an option. He stepped closer to the console, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Deploy the final wave," he said. "We end this now." The officers moved with renewed urgency, their movements fluid and precise. The room buzzed with the sound of commands, data streams, and the faint hum of engines. Kale's gaze locked on the command ship, its sleek outline bristling with weaponry. The faint taste of copper lingered in his mouth, a phantom reminder of the stakes. And as the final wave launched, a single thought burned in his mind. Who was still working against them? The question lingered, unanswered, as the battle raged on. The command center thrummed with an intensity that made the air feel charged, almost alive. Every console flickered with shifting data, every officer's focus razor-sharp as the battle pressed on. Kyle Dravik stood at the heart of it all, his shadow stretched long against the holographic projection of the Imperial fleet. The command ship's advance had thrown a gauntlet, one Kale knew he couldn't afford to ignore. "They're driving straight for the heart of our defenses," Ral said, his tone steady but edged with urgency. "They're not playing for attrition anymore. This is a final gambit." Kyle nodded, his mind working through the layers of possibilities. The Empire's movements weren't reckless. They were precise, calculated. It wasn't desperation, it was resolve. "They're testing the limits of our resolve," Kale murmured, his voice barely above a growl. "They want to see if we'll fold under pressure, but we won't." Varn returned to the room, his presence heavy with the grim weight of unfinished business. "Subsection C is secured. The traitors been neutralized, but they weren't working alone. Whoever gave them their orders, they're still out there." Kyle's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the console. "That means their intelligence is incomplete. They know enough to be dangerous, but not enough to outmaneuver us." Ral straightened, his sharp gaze fixing on Kale. "If they're committing this heavily, we need to shift the balance now. What's your play, Commander?" Kale stepped closer to the hologram, his fingers tracing the path of the Imperial command ship. Its escort vessels moved with almost mechanical precision, a wall of steel and firepower designed to absorb punishment while the flagship delivered the killing blow. "We can't outgun them head-on," Kyle said, his tone measured. "But we don't need to. We exploit their expectations. They think we'll throw everything we have at their strongest point. So we won't. Instead, we fracture them from within." Ral tilted his head, his brows furrowing. "You mean infiltrate?" Kale nodded, his mind already assembling the plan. "We launch an assault on their flanks, visible, deliberate. They'll divert resources to reinforce. Meanwhile, we deploy stealth teams inside their perimeter. Their command ship isn't just their strongest asset, it's their linchpin. If we sever their central coordination, their entire fleet collapses." Varn frowned. "Stealth insertion into that formation? It's a death sentence unless we pull their attention hard enough." "We will," Kale said firmly. He gestured to the hologram, his voice gaining momentum. "Ral, can we generate a localized electromagnetic pulse? Something strong enough to disable their short-range scans but contained to a small radius?" Ral's fingers flew across his console, his expression tightening with concentration. "Yes, but it'll require pinpoint accuracy. A single miscalculation and we risk disrupting our own systems." Kyle nodded. "We'll time it with the decoy assault. Their focus will be on the visible threat, and the EMP will blind them just long enough for our infiltration teams to slip through." And once inside? Varn asked, his voice heavy with skepticism. Kyle's gaze hardened, his tone like tempered steel. We take the fight to their bridge. We force them to engage on our terms. If we can disrupt their command structure, their fleet falls apart. Raoul leaned back, his expression thoughtful. It's risky. Coordinating that many moving pieces leaves no room for error. It's not a choice, Kale said. It's necessity. The Empire's strength lies in its hierarchy. Cut off the head, and the body crumbles. The officers around him exchanged glances, their resolve palpable despite the enormity of the task. Kyle inhaled deeply, the faint scent of ozone from the consoles grounding him in the moment. Soren, Kyle said, his voice sharp. Prepare the decoy fleet. I want them ready to engage on the eastern flank. Draw as much firepower as possible. Varn, assemble the infiltration team. You'll lead it personally. Raoul timed the EMP to coincide with the decoy strike. Every second counts. Yes, Commander, they replied in unison, their movements immediate and precise. The command center shifted into controlled chaos, every officer moving with purpose. The faint hum of engines spooling up filled the air, a rhythmic reminder of the machinery that underpinned their survival. Kale stood at the center of it all, his mind a storm of calculations, his gaze fixed on the hologram as if willing it to bend to his will. Minutes passed like hours, every tick of the clock a weight pressing down on his chest. The decoy fleet launched first, a swarm of cloaked vessels and projected signals that darted toward the Imperial formation, like a school of predatory fish. The hologram flared with movement as the Empire's ships shifted to intercept. They're taking the bait, Soren said, his voice tight with anticipation. Their eastern flank is repositioning. Kale's jaw tightened, his focus unrelenting. Hold the decoys just outside their range. Make them chase. The hologram shimmered as the decoy fleet danced at the edges of the Empire's reach, their movements erratic and unpredictable. The Imperial ships responded with calculated aggression, their formation fracturing as they pursued the elusive targets. EMP ready, Raoul reported, his voice calm despite the tension. Kale exhaled slowly. Activate on my mark. Varn, is your team in position? Varn's voice crackled over the comms. We're ready, waiting for the window. Kale's gaze remained locked on the hologram. The Imperial formation was splintering, their focus drawn away from the core. It was a perfect opening, if everything went according to plan. Now, Kyle said. The EMP detonated with a low, resonant hum, its shockwave rippling through the void like an invisible tide. The hologram flared briefly, then stabilized, showing the Imperial ships faltering as their short-range systems blinked out. EMP successful, Raoul confirmed. Their scans are offline. Varn, go, Kale ordered. The infiltration team launched in sleek cloak shuttles, their forms slipping through the Imperial perimeter like whispers in the dark. Kyle watched their progress intently, his pulse steady despite the weight of the moment. Commander, Soren said, his voice breaking the quiet. We're picking up movement on the western flank. They're compensating. Kale's eyes narrowed. Reposition the remaining drones to intercept. Buy us time. The hologram shifted again as the drones engaged, their strikes precise and surgical. The Imperial ships wavered, their cohesion fraying as the infiltration team closed in on the command ship. Varn's team has breached the perimeter, Raoul reported. They're inside. Kale's fist clenched at his sides, his focus unyielding. The hologram flickered, its faint glow casting long shadows across his face. Varn, Kale said over the comms, his voice steady but laced with steel. The next move is yours. Understood, Varn replied, his tone grim but resolute. The command center fell silent, every officer's attention locked on the unfolding battle. The faint hum of the systems, the subtle vibrations of the engines, it all faded into the background. Kale's chest tightened as he waited, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The plan was in motion, the pieces moving toward their final positions. And as the first faint echoes of combat filtered through the comms, Kale allowed himself a single thought. Victory was within reach, but the cost was still unknown. The faint crackle of static filled the command center as Kale Dravik stood motionless, his hands gripping the console's edge so tightly his knuckles blanched. Every eye in the room was locked on the flickering hologram, its pulsing glow reflecting the fragmented chaos of the battlefield. The infiltration team's signal flared intermittently, a fragile thread of hope amidst the vast expanse of uncertainty. Kale's breathing was steady, controlled, but his heart thundered against his ribs. "Varn, report," Kale said, his voice cutting through the charged silence. The comm line crackled to life, Varn's voice carrying a grim determination that bolstered the room. "We've breached their inner sanctum. Resistance is heavier than anticipated, but we're advancing." Kale's jaw tightened. "Time is against us, Colonel. Disable their command systems and extract. No heroics." There was a brief pause before Varn replied, his tone darkened by resolve. "Heroics aren't the plan, Commander. Survival is." Kale turned back to the hologram, tracing the jagged movements of the Imperial fleet. The enemy was faltering, their once coordinated strikes now reduced to erratic bursts. Yet the command ship remained a looming threat, its weapon systems lighting up with menacing precision. Ral stepped beside Kale, his expression grim. "The command ship is preparing a counter-assault. If they regain control of the fleet, we'll lose our advantage." Kyle nodded, his gaze locked on the hologram. "They won't get the chance." The command center's hum deepened as the remaining drones moved to intercept the enemy's regrouping efforts. Kale's orders were swift, calculated, each one a deliberate step toward the final outcome. The faint metallic tang of recycled air filled his lungs as he exhaled, grounding himself in the urgency of the moment. "Commander!" Soren's voice broke through the din, sharp with alarm. "New energy signature detected, centralized within the command ship. It's massive." Kale's eyes narrowed. "Define massive." Soren's hands flew over his console, his voice tightening. "Power readings are off the scale. It's some kind of failsafe designed to obliterate everything within its radius." Ral's expression darkened. "A self-destruct mechanism. If they can't win, they'll take us all with them." Kale's pulse quickened, but his voice remained steady. "Time until detonation?" 4 minutes, maybe less," Soren replied, his tone grim. Kale straightened, his presence commanding. "Varn, you need to disable that failsafe now. If it goes off, there won't be anything left of this sector." The comm line hissed with static before Varn's voice cut through, strained but resolute. "We're on it, but the core is heavily shielded. It's going to take time." "Make time," Kyle said, his voice a low growl. "Whatever it takes, stop that detonation." The tension in the room was suffocating, every second stretching into an eternity. Kyle's mind raced, calculating contingencies, weighing the impossible choices that lay ahead. The faint hum of the hologram seemed to echo his thoughts, a constant reminder of the stakes. Ral spoke quietly, his tone heavy. "If Varn's team fails, we need an evacuation plan." Kyle's gaze hardened, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "There is no evacuation. If we retreat now, we lose everything. This isn't just about Earth, it's about showing them we won't bow. Not now. Not ever." Ral nodded, his expression unreadable. The quiet resolve in Kyle's voice carried through the command center, settling over the officers like a mantle of steel. "Commander!" Varn's voice crackled back over the comm, the sound of distant gunfire punctuating his words. "We've reached the core. The failsafe mechanism is more intricate than we anticipated. Disabling it will take longer." Kyle's fists clenched at his sides. "How long?" "Too long," Varn admitted, his voice heavy. "But I have an alternative. We can overload the core and force a controlled detonation. It'll destroy the command ship and neutralize the failsafe, but it means—" His words trailed off, the implication hanging in the air like a thundercloud. Kale's chest tightened. It means you won't make it out. Varn's silence was answer enough. Kale's mind rebelled against the thought, every instinct screaming for another way. But there was no time, no other option. His voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. Are you certain? Yes, Varn replied without hesitation. This is the only way to end it. Kyle closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing against his very soul. When he opened them, they burned with unyielding resolve. Do it. The comm line crackled with static, then Varn's voice came through, steady and unshakable. It's been an honor, Commander. Tell them Earth stood. Kyle swallowed hard, his throat tight. They'll know. Every last one of them will know. The line went silent, and Kale's gaze returned to the hologram. The command ship's energy readings spiked, a violent crescendo that marked the end of Varn's mission. Then, with a blinding flash, the ship erupted in a cascade of light and debris, its destruction rippling through the Imperial fleet like a shockwave. The room erupted in cheers, a cathartic release of tension and fear. But Kyle remained still, his expression carved from stone. The weight of Varn's sacrifice bore down on him, a silent reminder of the cost of victory. Ral stepped beside him, his voice low. The command ship is destroyed. The fleet is in complete disarray. We've won. Kale nodded slowly, his gaze distant. We've shown them what humanity is capable of, but the battle is only the beginning. The hologram shifted, displaying the shattered remnants of the Imperial fleet retreating into the void. The once mighty, 1,000-year fleet, a symbol of the Empire's invincibility, lay in ruins. Kyle exhaled, the faint taste of copper lingering on his tongue, a bitter reminder of the cost of survival. Broadcast a message, Kale said finally, his voice steady, but filled with quiet intensity. To the Empire, to the galaxy. Let them hear us. Soren nodded, his hands moving over the console. Moments later, Kale's voice echoed across the comm lines, carried through the void to every corner of the battlefield. This is Commander Kale Dravik of Earth. To those who believed us weak, fractured, insignificant, you were wrong. We are united. We are resilient. And we will not bow to tyranny. His voice grew stronger, each word a hammer blow. Let this be a warning. If you come for us again, you will find nothing but ash and ruin. Earth stands, and it will stand forever. The message ended, and the room fell silent, the weight of Kale's words hanging in the air. Slowly, the officers turned back to their consoles, the quiet hum of the systems a backdrop to the beginning of humanity's new chapter. Kale stood alone, his gaze fixed on the faint remnants of the battle. The Empire had been shattered, their arrogance dismantled in the face of humanity's defiance. But Kale knew this was only the first step. The galaxy was watching, and Earth's place among the stars was far from certain. As the faint echoes of the battle faded into memory, Kale allowed himself a single thought. They came to break us, and instead, we broke them. Humanity will not just survive. We will rise.